International Plumbing Code, Chapter 1, Scope and Administration. Let's get into it. What we're looking at in this chapter is basically the rules of the game. If you consider any sport, a sport's going to have certain rules, including boundaries, certain ways that you can and cannot behave within the game. What does it mean to win or score? And so the rules are there. And you will also have people there to enforce the rules, referees or umpires or whatever. I call them empires. I mean umpires. Come on. Anyway, you have people who make sure that the game is played appropriately, right? And that's basically what we're looking at in Chapter 1. If we're going to play the game of plumbing, what are the boundaries? What are the rules? And who's in charge? Who's going to make sure that we play that way? And the code officials, or the inspectors, as we commonly refer to them, are the ones that make sure that these rules happen. So this chapter kind of lays out what are their roles and how does this all fit together. We're not even really specifically talking very much about plumbing, but more about like, what about this game? Yeah, what about this game? All right, so here we go into the text. We are in section 101, and this is where we start into scope and general requirements. And so the first 101.1, we're just looking at, okay, here's the title of the plumbing code and this code. 101.2 says scope. Now, scope is kind of a range of vision, right? What are we looking at here? The provisions of this code shall apply to the erection, installation, alteration, repairs, relocation, replacement, addition to, use or maintenance of plumbing systems within the jurisdiction. Maybe just summarized by saying, anytime there's plumbing involved, these guys are going to rule it, right? All right, so it says that this code also covers medical gas inhalation, anesthetic, vacuum piping, non-medical oxygen, sanitary and condensate vacuum collection systems. But the installation of fuel gas distribution, that they say, hey, go check out the International Fuel Gas Code. We got a whole other book for you there that you can use for that. Now, there is also an exception here where they reference us over to the International Residential Code. There are some specifics there on plumbing, but it's basically the same thing, but it's kind of tuned to residential stuff. So that's another place that we might look for plumbing information. We're going to look at in detail here at 101.3 for the purpose. Here, I'll do that in the next slide, but let me just mention 101.4 severability. Basically saying that if there's any section of this code that for any reason is held unconstitutional, well, it doesn't mean that the entire code is therefore not valid. It's like that little piece may not have worked where you're at, but the code is good. It is what it is. Let's look back here at the 101.3. What is the purpose? The very purpose of this code is to establish minimum standards that provide reasonable level of safety, health, and property protection and public welfare by, so those things we're trying to protect, right? Make sure people are safe and healthy. You know, plumbing can get out of control. Disease is pretty awful when it comes from your waste. Water can be extremely damaging. So we're going to keep everyone safe, and we're going to do this by regulating and controlling the design, construction, installation, quality of materials, location, operation, and maintenance or use of plumbing equipment systems. So let's just take control of the plumbing, making sure that it's safe, it's healthy, and we're protected. So 102, let's look at applicability. 102.1 says, where there is a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall govern. So if you're going through the code book, there's a couple things that apply to what you're working on. Again, the more specific requirement is going to be the one that you do. Okay. 102.2, existing installations. The question here being, if this plumbing already exists, and trust me, there are buildings all over the place here that have been around long before the International Plumbing Code, or even the Uniform Plumbing Code that we had before that, and maybe even before any code was in existence at all. Well, what do we do with those? Well, it's kind of like leave well enough alone. If it's not a problem, it says if there's not a hazard to health or life, property, then you can kind of just leave it as it is. We have a picture here as an example. In the 1980s, there was a lot of this gray polybutylene pipe installed. It was the precursor to PEX as we know it today. There were crimp rings, but this polybutylene pipe was really weak in the walls and ends up being kind of brittle, and the fittings tend to expand and contract and leak. So not a good thing, but it exists in a lot of buildings right now. Is it a good idea to cut it all out and repipe? Well, yeah, if you can get that done, and I've had customers that had me do that. But otherwise, if it's existing and it's not leaking, well, you can leave well enough alone. This picture shows connections of the more up-to-date PEX connecting to that polybutylene where they either had leaks or had made changes. But again, you don't have to rip a whole building apart just because it doesn't meet code at the moment. But if there's a problem, that's when you address it. Now, similarly, the code in 102.3 requires maintenance, that we actually maintain the plumbing parts and systems. It says if there's an original design and that design is safe and sanitary, well, then we can keep it, but we also need to maintain it. And that maintenance falls on the owner of the plumbing. They need to make sure that plumbing is maintained. When it comes to 102.4, additions, alterations, and repairs, it says additions, alterations, renovations, or repairs to any plumbing system shall conform to that required for the new plumbing system, without requiring the existing plumbing system to comply with all the requirements of this code. Again, going back to the example of polybutylene, in this picture we've got a section that went bad. They cut it out, replaced it with PEX that is approved, and we're not replacing the entire system, but you get the idea. 102.5 addresses the issue of change in occupancy. Now, first of all, we have to understand, what does that occupancy mean? We find this well defined in chapter 4 as we look at different types of fixtures and the number of fixtures that go into buildings, and they classify buildings by occupancy, and the occupancy is determined by what the building is used for. Oh, there we got to it, Tom. Occupancy is, what is the building used for? Is it a house? Is it a business? Is it a school? Is it a hospital? Is it a stadium? And for each of those, there's going to be a different plumbing requirement. So it says it is not lawful to just decide to use it for something else without getting approval and without making changes or updating the plumbing to meet the occupancy requirement. It says the code official shall certify that such structure meets the intent of the provisions of the law governing the building occupancy for new owners. Okay, example. You drive downtown, and in some of the older areas of town where they have these houses that may have been 100 years old, but it's now overgrown by business district. Well, those houses are converted into businesses. You see that quite often. There's a sign out front for real estate or insurance or whatever else they use these buildings for. And that's fine. They can change the use of a building, but again, they had to have gone through the process of changing the occupancy, updating the plumbing to meet that occupancy, and that's what 102.5 is all about. 102.6. Right here in Cache Valley, we also have some very old buildings that actually fit the historic building classification. Those buildings, if it fits into a historic building, they're not required, it's not mandatory that they update all the plumbing if it's going to affect the historical value of the building. Anything that they can, of course, they're going to put in or change, they're going to build that up to code. But this gives a little bit of wiggle room for these buildings that we kind of want to preserve for the historic sake. At times, buildings are moved. They may just pick it right up off of a foundation and move it to a new one, or maybe it's a manufactured building that's brought into place and set. Any of the plumbing connections to a moved building have to meet the requirements of code. 102.8 refers us to the code standards. There's a long list of standards for the way that manufacturers are to build the materials that we use. And they say if there's a conflict between what the code says and what the standards say, the code is going to be the winner between those two. We're going to do what is written in code. 102.9 talks about what happens if it's not in the code. How do you handle that? Well, the short story is you just talk to the code official and have them approve whatever you're working on that way. 102.10, if there are other laws that the state or local government have, the code is acknowledging that just because the code says this, but the law in the land is different, the code does not overrule the law of the land. Because it's that jurisdiction. For example, Utah is the one who decided to use the International Plumbing Code. They add amendments to that. They change it according to what we need here in Utah, and therefore, Utah has the ultimate rule. We're the ones who decided to use this code, and we're going to decide how we're going to use it, and therefore the code does not override existing law in the state. And 102.11 talks about applications of references. This is just kind of telling us how to use the code book. It says if it's telling you to go look at a chapter, but it doesn't give you a specific section, well, just go over and look at that. All right, let's see what it has to say in 103, Code Compliance Agency. Compliance agency is someone who's going to make sure that you comply, you do what is said in the code, right? So they have the creation of the agency in 103.1, and basically gives us this term of the code official. They shall be known as the code official. 103.2, this code official is appointed to that position. So a given jurisdiction, say a city, is going to hire someone and say, you are knowledgeable on plumbing or construction, and so we are going to appoint you as the code official. Now, those people who are hired as inspectors or code officials, a lot of times they come from some field of the construction trade. They may be framers, or when you get into a very large jurisdiction, like say Salt Lake City, they have enough need for inspectors that they will actually hire specific people, inspectors, for the specific trades. So you'll have a code official who focuses only on the plumbing, whereas in smaller jurisdictions, they'll have one inspector that covers the structural, plumbing, electrical, and HVAC, all of those things together. 103.3, the code official has the option to appoint deputies. Now, we don't call them deputies out there, we still call them inspectors. But basically, if you're seeing more than one inspector in an area, one of them is going to be the head, the code official, and the others are going to be deputies, given the same powers to inspect and enforce the code. Now, as I mentioned before, the further you get from civilization, the less civilized plumbing becomes. Inspectors and code officials are key in maintaining a high standard, a high quality. And this section 104 is what gives them those powers. So this goes over the duties and powers of a code official. 104.1 gives us the general information on this. It says a code official is hereby authorized and directed to enforce provisions of this code. The code official shall have the authority to render interpretations of this code and to adopt policies and procedures in order to clarify the application of its provisions. So we kind of see this listed here. They get to enforce the code, render interpretations to the code. That means you read it and they read it, and they're going to be able to say, well, this is what this means. You might have misunderstood, but let me clarify this for you. And one thing that they do not have is the power to waive requirements. They cannot say, well, I'm the code official, so you don't have to do that, or you got to do it this way because I said so. They do not have that power. Now, we recently looked at this process in modern plumbing, but in the code it spells this out as well. For construction purposes, you would need to submit an application and receive a permit, and it is the code official who reviews your application, the plans, and will provide a permit. The code official is also the one who comes out and does inspections, and there are other sections in this code that will tell us the specifics on how we go about inspections, but in short, they're the ones who would get to approve your work after an inspection. In 104.4, it tells us that these code officials have the right of entry, meaning in order to do their job, in order to inspect plumbing and make sure things are done right, they have the right to go into a property, whether you like it or not, whether you're ready or not. They can come in and have a look. 104.5 talks about how the code official should be carrying identification, meaning like you should be able to ask, oh, you're the code official? Really? Do you have a card or some sort of a badge, something that says that's really who you are? But the reality is that you as an apprentice or any journeyman or master plumber should also carry with you your identification. Make sure you have your card on your person. It makes it a lot easier to prove who you are if they have any questions. 104.6, the code official will issue notices or orders as they need things to be done. 104.7, they do keep a department of records. Those records would include the fees collected, reports of inspections, and things like that. 104.8, we look at liability. The code official, member of the Board of Appeals, etc., when they're acting in good faith without malice, that means as long as they're doing their job the best they can without being an intentional jerk, in the discharge of the duties required by this code or other pertinent law or ordinance, they shall not be thereby rendered civilly or criminally liable personally, and is hereby relieved of all personal liability for any damage accruing to persons or property as a result of any act or by reason of an act or omission in the discharge of these official duties. What this is saying is that if they tell you to do something and that results in an accident or a problem, you can't really sue them because they're just doing their job. They got to come out, they got to make sure things are done right. So as long as they're doing their best and acting in good faith, as they say, then they're not going to be held liable. Section 105 is titled Approval. The code official has the authority to approve things like 105.1, modifications. If there are changes that you feel need to be made, they can approve those changes depending on their interpretation of the code. 105.2, alternative materials, methods, and equipment. If there are things that need to be installed that may be outside of the norm, outside of normal materials methods that would be installed, you can submit a research report and they can approve those changes as necessary. Now, 105.3, changes like that might require testing to prove, yeah, this is going to be okay, it's a good system, it's a good method, and they would approve those testing methods. 105.4 states materials, equipment, and devices approved by the code official shall be constructed and installed in accordance with such approval. So if they say, yeah, you can do this, it's a little different than we would normally see, but yeah, you have my approval, well, then you got to do it the way that they said it should be done. 106, permits. Do you know when a plumbing permit is required? The truth is, there are a lot of plumbers and non-plumbers who do work that should be inspected, that should have a permit attached, but they don't. Even as simple as a water heater change out in most jurisdictions requires that you get a permit and get it inspected. So let's check this out. 106.1, where do we have to have a permit? Any owner's authorized agent or contractor who desires to construct, enlarge, alter, repair, move, demolish, or change the occupancy of a building or structure, or to erect, install, enlarge, alter, repair, remove, convert, or replace any plumbing system, whoa, that was a lot, the installation of which is regulated by this code, or to cause any such work to be performed, shall first make application to the code official and obtain a required permit. So you have the list there, and it's a very inclusive list, right? However, there are a few things that are exempt from requiring a permit, and here they are. The stoppage of leaks is one of them. This is in 106.2. So if there's a drain that's leaking and you just have to repair that, repair of fixtures, resetting of toilets, things like that. So stoppage of leaks in drains, water, soil, waste, or vent piping. If you have to go cut out a major section of that piping in order to make the repair, or if you're changing the system itself, well, that's going to require a permit. But if you're just making a repair on what's there, stopping a leak, then no permit is required. Also the clearing of stoppages. So this is where the roto-rooter type companies, any of those that are just in sewer drain cleaning, inspecting, they do not require permits to clear out the drains. 106.3, application for a permit. Here's an example of an application you can see on the screen. The application is going to ask for information about the work that's going to be done, and it has to be signed by the owner or the owner's authorized agent. A plumbing contractor can act as the owner's authorized agent. So as we turn in an application for a permit, we submit the construction documents. They may require a preliminary inspection. That would mean they go out and have a look at where this is at or what's going to be done before they provide those approvals. And there is also a time limitation on these permits. You have 180 days after the filing of the permit to get that work done. It says the code official has the authority to grant one or more extensions of another 180 days. So if this project is taking longer, then you would submit for extension. The idea with the time limitation being, let's make sure this project is moving along. If we put an expiration date on the permit, that means you're going to have to get some work done between now and 180 days. What they don't want is for someone to say, yeah, I'm going to take on this project and start building something or tearing something apart to remodel and then just stop and not finish. That doesn't help anyone. So the idea with the limitation is to keep things moving along. 106.4 talks about who is going to submit the application. It says the person or agent to install all or part of any plumbing system should be listed on the application. So most applications are going to require you to have your plumbing contractor number right on there so that they can say, yeah, okay, this is a legitimate plumber doing this work. 106.5 gives details about permit issuance, and without going into too much of that detail, let me just point out some of the specific things they talk about. Approved construction documents, basically you submit those and they get approved. The validity of those is discussed and what would render them not valid. The expiration is going to be listed as that permit is issued, as well as you have the option for extensions. There is also the possibility for them to suspend or revoke a permit if there are problems. If they have already approved something, this is the previous approvals, they don't need to go back through that whole process again. And finally, posting of the permit. It is required that when you have a permit, you post that somewhere visible on the job site. Section 110, construction documents, and this really outlines what is required. Section 110.1, construction documents include 2 or more sets of a plan, or you can give them a digital copy and then they can see and copy as many as they need. It does have to have a professional design. That means just like I needed my barn engineered, someone who actually professionally designs these things has to create those plans. It needs to be drawn to scale, have sufficient clarity so they can see what it is, and show details of structure and other things that will be built. 110.2 states that the code official will hold on to those construction documents at least 180 days after the completion of the project. 111 goes over notice of approval. Once you have been approved, the code official will send a notice of approval. This should be something in writing. And at the same time, they do have the power to revoke that approval if for any reason they change their mind. Section 112 goes over service utilities. The connection of those service utilities would not be allowed until the code official has approved that or authorized. That would mean, yes, you can hook up your gas, yes, you can hook up your waters, things like that. 112.2, they can provide authorization for temporary connection. 112.3, the code official has the authority to disconnect utility services if there are problems. Section 113 goes over stop work orders. This gives the code official the authority to insist that you stop work if what you're doing is not up to code or not approved, or particularly if it's unsafe or unsanitary. They'll issue a stop work order. They can do this in emergency settings. And in 113.4, failure to comply would result in fees. They can charge you for not doing what they say. Section 114 goes over means of appeal, and this is in place in the case that you should have a disagreement with a code official over a certain requirement. There is a board of appeals that you would talk to. They would review the situation. It says the board shall not have the authority to waive requirements of this code or interpret the administration of this code. So that's in 114.2. 114.3, the Board of Appeals shall consist of members who are qualified in experience and training, but are not employees of the jurisdiction. So they're kind of an outside group that's going to help make a decision on the ruling. And 114.4, the code official shall take immediate action in accordance with the decision of the board. So they're going to help guide the decision from there. Section 115 goes over violations. Now, if I as a plumber decide not to do what is written in the code, then according to 115.1, I am breaking the law. It is against the law not to do what the code requires. In 115.2, I would receive a notice of violation saying, hey man, you're breaking the law. You can't do that. Or you have to do it this way. In 115.3, it talks about the prosecution of my violation, of me for my violation. 115.4, there are going to be penalties attached to my violation. 115.5 gives the option of an abatement of that violation. 115.6. 115.6 goes over unsafe plumbing. It says any plumbing regulated by this code that is unsafe or that constitutes a fire or health hazard, insanitary condition, or is otherwise dangerous to human life is hereby declared unsafe. So they provide that definition. Any use of plumbing regulated by this code constituting a hazard to safety, health, or public welfare by reason of inadequate maintenance, dilapidation, obsolescence, fire hazard, disaster, damage, or abandonment is hereby declared an unsafe use. So they've made sure that we understand and that we would need to repair or rehabilitate that. 115.6.1 gives the authority to condemn equipment to the code official. 115.6.2, the authority to disconnect service utilities, as we've talked about before. And 115.6.3, the code official can authorize a connection after the order to disconnect. All right, guys, that concludes our discussion and presentation on International Plumbing Code Chapter 1 on Scope and Administration.